You know, when a judge makes a ruling, we tend to think that's it, right? The final word. But what happens when that final word hinges on a single 24-hour mistake? So today we're going to dive into this idea of the legal point of no return, that moment when a court's decision becomes totally unchangeable. And we're going to do it by looking at a real case that all came down to being just one day late.
So, here's what we've got lined up. First, we'll get into the story of that missed deadline. Then, we'll unpack this really powerful idea called the immutable judgment rule. From there, we'll look at why a rule like this is so important, check out the super rare times it can actually be bent, and wrap things up by talking about this constant balancing act between having firm rules and getting to a just outcome.
All right, let me ask you this, and it sounds simple, but the implications are huge. Imagine you're in a legal fight, and you've got this super strict deadline to file an appeal. What happens if you miss it by just one day? I mean, does your entire case just poof, disappear? Let's find out how that exact scenario played out for someone.
And that brings us right to the case of a woman named Pacheco. You know, her legal fight went all the way to the Supreme Court, but here's the kicker. It wasn't really about the core of her argument. Nope, it was all about a simple timing issue.
Okay, so this timeline really lays out the whole problem. So, Pacheco gets the final order on January 10th. That starts a 15-day clock ticking for her to file an appeal. The last day to do that? January 25th. But as you can see, her appeal wasn't filed until the 26th, just one day late. And that single day, well, that's what this entire case hangs on. And wow, the consequences were immediate and frankly, severe. The Court of Appeals, they didn't even bother looking at the substance of her case. They just dismissed the appeal, flat out, because it was late. So Pacheco takes this fight all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they said the exact same thing, the dismissal stands. So why? Why such a harsh, absolute outcome for a one-day delay? The answer is hiding in this really powerful legal doctrine.
And that's where we run into the core legal principle behind that tough dismissal. It's called the immutability of judgments. And you can basically think of it as the legal point of no return.
So, here's the main idea. Once that window to file an appeal closes, a judgment becomes what's called final and executory. That basically means it's locked in, it's set in stone, and it's ready to be enforced. And the Supreme Court has been incredibly clear about this. Once it's final, it can't be changed, not in any way, not even if it turns out the original decision was wrong. Heck, not even by the Supreme Court itself.
And this quote from another case really sums up the why behind it all. The whole point is to bring disputes to a definitive end. I mean, think about it. Without this rule, court cases could just go on forever and ever, with people constantly trying to reopen them. The goal is to write finis, the end, so that legal battles are over and everyone can finally move on.
But it's not just about stopping arguments, you know? Sticking to these rules, it's absolutely essential for the whole justice system to work properly. Let's break down exactly why that is. So the court basically says these rules are like a shield, protecting the system from total chaos and endless delays, right? Without a firm endpoint, cases could just drag on and on. This rule brings stability, it makes court judgments reliable, and it forces everyone in the process to respect the rules of the game. It's the system's way of making sure there's a clear, orderly path to a final resolution. Here's a good way to think about it. A final judgment, it's like the final whistle in a big game. The score is set, a winner is declared, and that's it. Game over. Everyone can go home. But an endless argument? That's like a game with no clock and no whistle, where the teams could just play forever with no winner. The justice system absolutely needs that final whistle.
Okay, so this rule sounds totally absolute, right? A deadline is a deadline. A final judgment is final. End of story. But is it always? Well, like with a lot of things in law, there are a few very specific exceptions where the rules can be bent just a little.
And this is probably what you're thinking right now, right? I mean, what if sticking to this rule would cause a huge, massive injustice? Is there some kind of safety valve built into the system? Well, the answer is yes, but the bar to use it is incredibly high.
And when I say the exceptions are narrow, I mean they are really narrow. We're talking about things like fixing a simple typo or a math mistake, like if a judgment accidentally said $100,000 instead of $10,000. Or an order that just clarifies what the original ruling meant without actually changing the outcome. The bigger exceptions are way more rare. You've got void judgments, which is like if a traffic court tried to issue a ruling on a murder case, they just don't have the power. Or a supervening event, which is when something totally unexpected and major happens after the decision that makes enforcing it completely unfair.
And on top of those really technical exceptions, there is one more possibility. The courts have said, okay, we can relax this rule to serve the ends of substantial justice, but only when we're talking about really fundamental rights, things involving life, liberty, honor, or property. But this is reserved for only the most extreme circumstances. And in Ms. Pacheco's case, the courts just didn't see a reason that compelling.
So all of this really brings us to the heart of the issue. Because this whole concept is really just a delicate balancing act between two really important goals of the legal system.
See, on one side of the scale, you've got the need for order, for predictability, the idea that rules and deadlines have to mean something. But on the other side, you have the desire for substantial justice, getting to the right and fair result. And the Pacheco case? It shows the court coming down hard on the side of the rules.
But it's also really important to understand that there's another point of view out there in the legal world. This quote right here, it really shows the other side of that coin. It argues that, hey, it's much better to decide a case on what actually happened on the merits than to just throw it out on a technicality that could lead to a really unfair outcome. And this just perfectly highlights the tension that judges have to deal with every single day.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The Pacheco case makes it pretty clear. To keep the system running smoothly, rules are king. But the bigger question is still out there. Should a strict rule ever be allowed to stand in the way of what just feels right? In the incredibly complex world of law, finding that perfect balance might just be the ultimate unending challenge.